This conference will now be recorded.
Hello everyone, this is Naresh, Certified Kubernetes Administrator. In this video, we're going to talk about Kubernetes config maps. So let's look at the quick agenda that we're going to do it. So we're going to try to understand why we need config maps and what exactly is config map in Kubernetes, how to create these config maps and how to use these config maps inside the pod specification. And then finally, we'll try to do a quick demo to finish it up. So let's proceed. And by taking a scenario team, let's take a scenario to understand this Kubernetes config maps. Let's assume that I have my application which needs to talk to a database for writing the client's data. Think about that. Now that is the scenario here. And as per the container definition, we need to keep all applications dependencies inside the application image itself. By assuming this, I also kept my database connection properties inside the image while preparing the image at the development stage. Now I deployed this image at my development environment and I tested the containers of my application was working absolutely fine. Now I thought that the application is absolutely working fine. Then I started shipping the same image into the production. Now, when I deployed this image into the production, because we had the development database connection properties inside the image itself, it still tries to connect to the development database. But whereas in production, we always use a different database for the client's data. Now, in this case, team, or this means that the application image that we prepared is not portable, means that the application image cannot be deployed or cannot be utilized anywhere except the development environment. We need to decouple such environment level configuration from images to keep the images portable and pass this configuration objects or properties at runtime to the containers. Now this is where team we talk about something called as config maps in Kubernetes will help you to do that one. So if you try to understand the config map definition, the config map allows you to decouple configuration artifacts from the image content to keep the containerized application portable, right? That is what is a solution we needed. So config maps allows you to do that one. So what is a config map again in Kubernetes terminology? So config map is an API object in Kubernetes that lets you store configuration and provide these configurations to your containers at runtime. So simply look at these things. Let's proceed. Right, so how do we create these config maps in the Kubernetes? So we can simply create these config maps in Kubernetes using a kubectl config map create command, a config map and the map name, and by using a data source, what kind of a data that we want to store it into the config map. We can directly use a files, any kind of a file that can be used to create a config map, or we can directly use of some literal values like key value paste directly to put into the config map. So we can create these config maps in different ways. That is how we use it. By using kubectl command, create command, we usually create the config maps. Of course, we can also use the declarative model to create a config map using a YAML files also. But in this scenario, we're going to use simply kubectl create command to create the config maps. Once we create this, how do we inject these things into the pods? Let's try to understand that how to use the config maps inside a pods. So in order to use the inside the pods, we must create the config map object in Kubernetes cluster before we reference it inside the pod spec. So once the pod spec or once the config map object is created, we can inject the config map data into the pods using by attaching a volume to the pod. We can inject this data into the volume and then we can reference the path inside the pod spec by using a volume, or we can also inject the same data as environment variables inside the pod spec again. Now this is how we can inject the data into the pod stream at runtime so that containers can utilize these configuration properties to run your application. Now if you reference the config map in pod spec which does not exist, pod will fail to start. So we must be very careful while referencing a config map inside the pod spec. So we have to be very careful. Now with this understanding of the things team, so let's jump onto a quick demo. How do we create these config maps in the Kubernetes cluster? So we assume that team, before you watching this one or before you starting this one, you must have an idea about kubectl command line and how to create a pod or what is a pod in Kubernetes. We must expect that that is a prerequisite. So that is what you can think about it. Now here team, let's start creating a config map first of all from a file. So I have the data available here on my machine. Let's say that I have a properties file called as db.properties. Now let me show you these properties here simply. Now you can see that inside this I have mentioned my database name, database connection URL, whatever the database properties that are required. So these information need to be passed on to my application at runtime because this information is not part of the image. So how do I do that? So we create a config map in Kubernetes using these values, and then we can pass these values to the pods or running containers at runtime so application can utilize these things accordingly. So let's start creating a config map by using the file first of all, and then we can also use by different literal values that also will do it. So let's use command line called as kubectl create config map and a config map name. Let's say that this is my db config or dbconf1. I'm giving it as just reference. And here, because we are going to use the file to create this config map, so we must use something called as from file is equals to and the file name that you're going to do it. Simply create this one. So it says the config map is created successfully. So we can always get the config maps and describe the config map to see what is inside that one. So kubectl get config map to list the config maps that are available in your Kubernetes cluster. And if you want to know more details about it, you can always describe the config map, and then the config map name. So dbconf1, we can see it. dbconf1, see this, you can see that the database is available. Now these values are stored at your etcd data store team. By default, Kubernetes stores all this information inside the etcd database that you have it in part of the cluster. So that is where the values get stored. Now once the config map is available, once the config map is created successfully, these data can be injected into the pods at runtime. Whenever you run a pod in Kubernetes cluster, these data can be injected into the pod by using various mechanisms, like by using volumes or by using environment variables. Also, we can do it. So we'll look at both of the things. So first, look at the by volume concept. So we can do it. Let's me create a pod spec which has a volume in it. So we have a pod definition here ready for us. Let's look at it and we'll try to understand. Now here the pod specification, as you must be knowing all these things accordingly. So simply we are referencing the volumes here and the name of the volume, but the content of this volume is referenced from the config map, and we must mention the config map name here that we created. So the config map name that we created is simply called as dbconf1. So just reference that, and the same thing will be mounted. The data will be injected into this volume, and the volume data need to be injected or mounted onto a container using the mount path. So we are using the volume mounts in this pod spec, container spec. So here the name of the volume that we want to use it, and inside the container at what location we want to mount these properties. So /app config is something inside the container spec will be available for us. So let's quickly create this pod and we'll see whether we are able to see the data inside the pod or not. So let's create it. kubectl create -f a volume pod. We can do it. Simply see that the pod is getting created here. kubectl get pods. So the pod is up and running. So in order to validate whether my config map data is available inside the pod or not, so we can simply get inside the pod definition or pod, and then we can validate at the location we mounted. So let's use the kubectl exec command here to get inside the pod, right? And then we can simply validate that data. Bin bash, we can simply get inside the pod. And we remember we mounted inside the container at a /app config. So let's go to the /app config folder, and you can see that the database properties are available here. We can simply look at more database properties. As we can see that whatever the data that we were passed inside the config map now is available inside the container. So application can please refer to this file or grab the values from this file and start making a connection to the production database accordingly. Now this is how team we can make the application images more portable. That is what we call it, by decoupling the whatever the necessary information need to be decoupled from the image content. Now this is one way of creating your config map. So let's get out of this pod again. So the first way of creating the config map team by using the property file or by using a file, basically we can have n number of files also. We can create the config map from multiple files also, that is possible. So in that case, we can use a directory path, or we can even use something from file from multiple times, like kubectl create config from file, and from file again we can simply give another file here. Let's say that we can use another file also is equals to whatever you have another file, you can simply pass it on. Means that the cube's config map will allow you to create a config map from using different files at once. Also we can use that. Now this is the concept, like how we can inject the data or how we can create a config map using a property file and inject the data into the containers at runtime by using a volume concept. Now let's try to go for the second method, which is going to be, we're going to create a config map using a literal values, which means that directly a key value pair instead of a file, and we can inject the same data into the pod or container spec again using environment variables instead of using a volume concept. So let's do that one also. So kubectl create config map. Let's say that this time I'm creating dbconf2, but here this time I'm not going to use a file, but I'm going to pass the values directly. Let's say that here this is called as from literal, right? So is equals to, we just need to use the key value pairs, right? So let's say that db name, or let's say that db host is equals to my db, and along with that I can pass another thing again from literal. So this time we're going to pass something called as db url, whatever it is, and is equals to let's say that we are going to pass the JDBC URL, JDBC dot oracle dot thin. If you know database connection properties team, you can see that, and at the rate mydb host and the port number of your database 1521, similar to this, right? This is the two value stream. Likewise, you can pass on any number of values, key value pairs, directly to the config map. So you can see that kubectl create config map. This one, earlier we used a file to create the properties, now we are using the literal values directly to create a config map. So let's create this one. You can see that the dbconf2 is created. It says that dbconf2, it's a spelling mistake, that should be fine. So kubectl get config maps, again we can use it. We can see that the config map is available. Kubectl describe a config map simply, and then you can use the value. Okay, now you can see that there is a db host and value is available. This is just like a key value page, simple as it is. There are two key value pages available inside my config map. Now earlier we used volume to do it. We can still use this as a volume to inject into the pod spec, but this time we're going to use a different mechanism. Let's import this, or let's take these values and get them, or declare them as environment variables inside the pod. So how do I use that? Again, we can simply use have a pod specification ready. Let's look at this. Here we can see that the same thing again, everything is there, but here we are using env from, means we are creating environment variables inside the pod, and we are getting the environment variables from config map reference. We are just doing it, and the name of the config map, which is going to be uh, dbcont. Basically I think we have given us some wrong spelling there, that's okay. Cont2, this is what is a config map. Let's validate the name once. I believe dbcont2, that is what the name of the config map. So let's look at this. So simply give this value. We are injecting the config map data now as environment variables inside the pod spec. Let's see if we are able to do this successfully or not. Now let's deploy this pod. Kubectl create -f env pod. That's great. So let's look at this. Now we see that the data is created, I believe. Kubectl get pods. Okay, our env-vars pod is also running. So let's validate these environment variables, or let's validate these are imported as environment variables inside the pod or not. So we can get inside the pod again, kubectl exec -it, whatever it is, let's say that bin bash, get inside the pod and check the environment variables of this pod altogether. You can simply say env here to check the environment variables. Okay, there are a lot of variables here. What we'll do is let's grab the values for the db. So grab db here. Okay, we can see that our both values that we have given inside the config map are injected as environment variables inside the config map, right? So this is how team we can make our applications more portable. Application images are portable. That is how we need to do it. Decouple the configuration from the image content as it is required. Mostly the environment specific configuration that we cannot keep it inside the image content must be decoupled, and the way you pass them into the containers at runtimes in Kubernetes is using by the config maps. So config maps is this allows you to do this kinds of concept team. So that's all about for this video, and thank you so much. Please follow us. Thank you so much.